What's up, college football addicts? Now, today, I'm going to talk to you guys about why the ACC is in serious trouble and why the contract that is supposed to save the league may actually end up being what kills it. And it doesn't matter whether you're a fan of a team that's trying to escape the ACC or a fan of a team that's trying to preserve it. I've got some pretty critical information coming up on the ACC's grant of rights, which you need to know so that you can understand the threat to your team. Because if your team doesn't understand the grant of rights' weaknesses, you could be blindsided and stuck in a failing league for the next 12 years. I'm also going to tell you about the recent massive flaw that Clemson found in the grant of rights that may completely blow the exit doors open. But before we get started, I do want to take just a moment to thank you for joining us. I am very happy to have you here at College Football Addiction. So, the teams trying to escape the ACC's grant of rights have several layers of legal arguments that they plan on using. Before we get into those arguments, it's important for you to understand two key details. The first detail is that the grant of rights contract states that it runs until 2036. The next is that the grant of rights was signed by all the ACC members. So the first massive weakness in the grant of rights is alarming. Imagine that you have a cell phone contract and you pay for insurance on your cell phone. Now think of your insurance on your cell phone as the grant of rights. It's designed to protect that investment. Now also imagine you go to make a change to your cell phone contract. Say you add another line or drop down to a lower plan. And the moment it happens, the insurance on your cell phone immediately cancels. This is how the grant of rights works. Except unlike a cell phone contract, it's not just your cell provider and you. It's more like you and 14 other people. And they all have to agree to re-sign in order for you to get back your phone insurance. Now, again, this is how the grant of rights works because it is tied to the existing ESPN media deal. And this is a huge flaw with major implications for your team. If the existing ESPN media deal changes at all, the grant of rights has to be redone. If ESPN decides not to renew the media deal and the ACC has to move to another provider, the grant of rights has to be redone at that time. And that's not an option. It is spelled out in the grant of rights itself. But as bad as that is, there's something that's even more important that you all need to understand about the ACC's grant of rights. And that's what the ACC commissioner did with the grant of rights in 2021, which basically set it on fire. Now, take a moment and imagine that you have health insurance and you need this insurance for life-saving treatment. But your health insurance company has the power to cut you at any time for any reason or for no reason at all, including the very moment that you get sick and cease to be profitable to them. Well, again, this is how the grant of rights works. In 2021, ESPN had a unilateral option to extend or end the ACC media deal. The thing is, ESPN never made the decision at the deadline. But that didn't mean the contract auto-extended because that's not how it's worded. In refusing to make the decision, ESPN told the ACC, we're pushing the date back as we see fit, putting the ACC media deal and the grant of rights in a total gray area beyond 2021. But again, that's not even the worst part, because what former ACC commissioner John Swofford did in response to this was truly mind-blowing. Before we get to that, though, I want to ask you a quick question. Imagine that you're a member of the ACC. Would you think that this information about ESPN being able to unilaterally end the deal in 2021, would you consider that material? Would you think that that info about ESPN pushing the dates back was material or needed to be known by everyone? Would you want to have any say on that if you were a member of the conference? Whether ESPN could move around the dates however they wanted? Or would you be okay with the ACC commissioner deciding everything on his own without telling you? Now, would you be okay with him ignoring the ACC bylaws and not having a vote on this? Because that is what teams are alleging against former ACC commissioner John Swofford. And again, this isn't opinion. This is clearly and completely spelled out in the court cases. And due to how it was handled with the bylaws being completely disregarded, it is going to be a massive problem for the ACC. It's going to be a problem for the ACC to even prove that the grant of rights was enforceable past 2021, but not nearly as big of a problem as Clemson has thrown at the ACC. Just before I get to that, there's another major problem that could completely wreck the ACC's grant of rights. Again, we'll go back to the cell phone imagination. Imagine that you have a cell phone contract, right? And you're trying to determine if the contract has run out so that you can switch cell providers. But when you go to look, the contract has 3 to 4 different dates in different places, and they all contradict one another. And one of them has an asterisk next to it, which says the company can change it at any time, it being the end date. And that's exactly what you again have with the ACC's grant of rights. Trying to determine the actual number of years remaining on the deal is like trying to ride a bike up the top of a mountain made of jello. You see, the value of the grant of rights is determined by the number of years remaining on the deal. And the grant of rights itself says that the deal goes until 2036. But remember a few things that I mentioned earlier. Number one, the grant of rights only applies to service the current ACC media deal. And the second is that the former ACC commissioner pushed ESPN's unilateral option to end that media deal back to 2025, which will take effect in 2027. You put those two things together and it becomes very clear that any team that's looking to leave the conference would almost certainly not have to pay that full $550 million withdrawal penalty that the media has estimated based on calculating it out to the 2036 season. And instead, it seems like they'd only be on the hook until 2027, which would greatly lower the amount of any settlement. So even if the first two layers that we mentioned fall through and the teams leaving have to settle, which is already a long shot, it is an almost certainty that they would only be settling through what would be the 2027 season. And just doing the math, you can completely toss out that $550 million number because teams exiting would use $90 million or so as a starting point for negotiations. But of all the attacks being used in the ACC's grant of rights, none were bigger than the ones launched recently by Clemson, because the one Clemson launched was a backdoor attack executed like a complete ninja, and it caught everyone in the ACC off guard. See, when you are in ninja school learning how to fight from your sensei, the most important thing that Master Splinter teaches you is how to use your opponent's leverage against them. So when they come charging at you, you step aside and you use that energy to deliver a pretty crushing blow. And that's what Clemson did. Now, quick refresher on a massive key argument from their legal filing, which was highly entertaining. Now, Clemson argued as a grant of rights was written and being interpreted by the ACC that the ACC could expel a member with 3/4 of a vote and still own their media rights until 2036. And they said the ACC stance on this was nonsensical, and their reading of the grant of rights agreement is plain wrong and inconsistent of the language that's there within the agreement. And those are their words, not mine. Trust me, I use much harsher words than Clemson did, but the main Clemson argument against the grant of rights was the most brutal part. Clemson's main arguments used the grant of rights and the ESPN's media agreements wording against itself. And because of this, these arguments have huge and meaningful implications. See, the very wording on the ACC grant of rights explicitly states it grants the conference rights necessary for the conference to perform the contractual obligations. And then it goes on to say that the school must perform all contractual obligations of a member institution during the term that are expressly set forth in the ESPN agreement. You see, the problem with that is that the grant of rights scope contradicts the defined ESPN media agreement scope. In fact, not only does the grant of rights scope contradict the media, it also contradicts itself. Clemson makes a compelling argument that necessary for the conference to perform clause is limited by what's set forth in the ESPN agreement, and that the agreement limits the grant of full media rights in scope whether Clemson is a member of the ACC. And it's right there in the grant of rights for everyone to see. This argument is like a freight train, and the ACC is like a car broken down in the middle of the crossing. And the ACC lawyers know this. So now that you understand just how horrible the situation is with the ACC's grant of rights, the problem is that this is only half of what's critically important for the league's future. The other half deals with the epic bombshell that Florida State's Board of Trustees lobbed at the ACC recently. So make sure that you're caught up by clicking the video on the screen now if you want to learn more about that.